Hello, my friends. What struck me first, before Davos, before the money, before the oil room theatrics, was the sheer brazenness of the question that opened this latest round of political theater. After the operation to capture Nicolas Maduro, a Ukrainian leader publicly floated the idea that if this is how it works with dictators, then Washington knows what to do next. In other words, if the United States can reach into one country and snatch a head of state, why not do the same to Vladimir Putin? A reporter asked the obvious follow-up: would President Trump ever order a mission to capture Putin? Trump's answer was pure Trump, half improvisation, half performance, half contradiction. He said it wouldn't be necessary. He said he's always had a great relationship with Putin. Then he said he's disappointed. He sprinkled in his familiar boast he settled 8 wars and implied this one should have been easy, middle of the pack, or one of the simpler deals. That alone tells you something. Trump sees conflicts less as historical collisions of nations and more as transactional disputes he can close, like real estate. That worldview is already dangerous. But what came next was more revealing. He pivoted straight to Greenland, and he did it in the language of coercion. The US will do something on Greenland, whether they like it or not. If it doesn't happen the easy way, it happens the hard way, because otherwise Russia or China will take over Greenland, and the United States won't have Russia or China as a neighbor. And let's be blunt. That neighbor line is nonsense on its face. The United States is already a neighbor of Russia via Alaska and the Bering Strait. Any serious national security professional knows that. What matters isn't whether Russia is next door. What matters is positioning, the ability to project power, control sea lanes, dominate the Arctic approaches, and pressure an adversary's perimeter. When Trump blurts out, we're going to do it one way or the other, he's not accidentally misspeaking. He's telegraphing the deeper logic of Washington's empire. Contain Russia, then tighten the vice on China. And if you want the connective tissue, the money trail that turns this from rhetoric into policy, look at the calendar, because all of this is now being narrated against the backdrop of Davos and the World Economic Forum, scheduled for January 19 to January 23. Davos isn't just a conference. It's where the transnational class meets to harmonize narratives, coordinate capital, and stamp inevitability onto whatever scheme is being sold to the public. According to multiple reports circulating first through the UK press, Trump and Zelensky are expected to meet in Davos and sign what's being described as an $800 billion prosperity package for Ukraine, an investment package spread across 10 years. The framing is always soothing: reconstruction, security guarantees, post-war prosperity. The language is designed to lull people into thinking this is about hospitals and schools, but the scale $800 billion is not humanitarian reconstruction. It's a long-term financial architecture for ownership, leverage, and control. And notice the choreography. Zelensky was supposedly set to travel to Washington, but European leaders, per these reports, discouraged the Oval Office visit and urged him to meet Trump in Davos instead. That matters. They want the deal made inside the Davos ecosystem, where the political class can shelter behind the aura of global consensus, away from direct public scrutiny and away from the messy optics of another made-for-TV Oval Office photo op. Now, to be fair, I have not seen the White House publicly confirm the $800 billion figure. That number may get massaged, but what I have seen repeatedly is the steady drumbeat that a major U.S. Ukraine reconstruction prosperity arrangement is being finalized. The exact dollar amount becomes the headline hook. The underlying structure, who controls what, who gets paid, who owns the extraction rights, remains the real story. And here is the point too many people miss. Spreading it over 10 years is not a restraint, it's a feature. It provides time for money to move, for contracts to be layered, for intermediaries to take their cuts, for political risk to be diluted, and for the entire Ukraine project, already notorious for corruption, to keep functioning as what it has been for years, a washing machine for Western cash. 10 years gives the machine time to spin. It is, in a word, institutionalized looting under the banner of democracy. Then comes the second trail of breadcrumbs. A Trump-connected billionaire is reported by major U.S. media to be investing in Ukrainian lithium, specifically tied to a tender for what's described as Ukraine's largest lithium deposit in the Kirovohrad region. The name circulating is Ronald Lauder, and what makes the story more telling is the claim that this same figure once floated the Greenland idea to Trump. Do you see the pattern? Greenland is sold as national security, Ukraine is sold as freedom, Venezuela is sold as stability, Iran is sold as human rights. But the connective tissue is always the same: resources, rare earths, lithium, oil, Arctic positioning and the use of U.S. power to restructure foreign states in ways that benefit a narrow set of interests. And Russia, if it is serious about defending its long-term strategic space, will not treat these announcements as harmless press chatter. Moscow understands what this is. Moscow has watched this movie for decades. Foreign capital arrives before peace arrives, because the investors are not wagering on peace, they are wagering on control. Which brings us to the meeting that, to my mind, was the real headline. Trump convening big oil at the White House, America's oligarchy gathered around the table to discuss foreign policy as though it were a corporate acquisition. All we were missing was big tech and big pharma to complete the portrait of who runs the United States. But even with only big oil present, the message was unmistakable. The empire's priorities are shaped in rooms like that by executives, lobbyists, and politicians who treat entire nations as line items. The primary topic was Venezuela. Of course it was, because Venezuela is the prize that changes the global energy chessboard, especially if Washington believes it can fold Venezuelan output into a U.S.-directed system and thus tilt the world's oil balance. The rhetoric coming out of these circles is astonishing. The suggestion that with Venezuela in the fold, Washington would effectively command something like 55% of the world's oil. The number gets thrown around in various forms. Whether that figure is precise or inflated is almost beside the point. The mentality is what matters. They see Venezuelan oil as a lever for global dominance. Chevron already operating in Venezuela sounded optimistic, though cautious. It dangled the promise that with the right policies and U.S. backing, output could be tripled or quadrupled. But then Exxon's posture was markedly different. Cold, skeptical, corporate realistic. The Exxon CEO's word, as reported, was essentially, Venezuela is uninvestable under current legal and commercial frameworks. And he's right on the narrow corporate merits. Without durable legal protections, stable hydrocarbon law, and enforceable contract structures, major capital views it as too risky. But listen carefully, this is not a debate about whether Venezuelans should control Venezuela. This is a debate about what conditions Venezuela must accept to be deemed investable by foreign corporations, meaning, in plain English, what legal sovereignty must be surrendered to make extraction safe for outsiders. There was even a moment of farce, a note passed to Trump, apparently from Rubio, suggesting they go back to Chevron to discuss something, as if the meeting were a scripted stage play. Skip the pessimism, return to the optimistic talking points. Then Trump publicly thanked Venezuela for 30 million barrels of oil given to the United States, language that already assumes the relationship is one of tribute. And the accompanying idea, voiced in this orbit, is even more revealing. Whatever money Venezuela receives from oil sales would be constrained so that Venezuela then purchases American products, equipment, food, medicine, everything effectively, turning Venezuela into a captive consumer market financed by its own resource extraction. That's not partnership. That's a managed client model. Meanwhile, while oil executives talk about frameworks and investment protections, Washington also talks about arrests, captures, and transitions. This is how regime change politics is normalized. First the language, then the money, then the security assistance, then the permanent economic tether. Now loop back to the earlier capture Putin question. A reporter referenced Zelensky's insinuation and asked Trump whether he would do the same to Putin. Trump said it wouldn't be necessary. Then he did the classic two-step. He praised his relationship with Putin, then said he was disappointed. That's not strategy. It's mood-based performance. But Trump also said something else in that room, that Putin is not afraid of Europe, but is afraid of the United States, at least the United States under Trump. The implication is that Russia fears him, whereas it did not fear Biden. I'm skeptical. Russia does not fear Trump in the way Trump imagines. Russia calculates. Russia evaluates capabilities, intent, and constraints. Europe's problem isn't that Putin is not afraid of it. Europe's problem is that Europe has hollowed out industrial capacity, outsourced energy leverage, and subordinated strategic autonomy to Washington. Russia doesn't need to fear Europe. It needs to understand Europe's dependence. Then Trump returned to Greenland, repeating the claim, if the U.S. doesn't take Greenland, Russia or China will. And again, he said the U.S. doesn't want Russia or China as neighbors. The room, apparently, had no one willing to tell the president the basic geopolitical reality that the U.S. is already a neighbor to Russia. That silence matters. It shows how these circles operate. They indulge slogans rather than confront facts, because slogans are useful for selling policy. And then came the most revealing rhetorical slip, what I would call confession through projection. When Trump frames the Greenland move as preventing Russia and China from becoming neighbors, What he is really admitting is that Washington's aim is to move closer to Russia to tighten containment in the Arctic, lock down strategic routes, and secure rare earth and resource positioning. The Arctic isn't just ice, it's shipping lanes, submarine corridors, minerals, and future leverage. Trump's easy way, hard way line wasn't diplomacy. It was Godfather mode, the language of coercion. I'd like to make a deal the easy way, but if we can't, we'll do it the hard way. That is not how sovereign nations talk to each other unless they assume imperial entitlement. He even mocked the concept of historical presence, saying essentially that just because someone landed somewhere 500 years ago doesn't mean they own it. He seemed to extend the logic to Greenlanders themselves, implying that historical residence doesn't confer ownership. That's colonial logic, stripped bare. People on land are obstacles. Ownership is defined by force and paperwork. Then he pivoted to Europe, talking about immigration, about Europe changing, about needing to get its act together. Again, this is classic. Talk about migration as cultural anxiety, while quietly advancing policies that destabilize regions and create migration flows in the first place. From there, the narrative widened to Iran, and the pattern repeated. Internal unrest becomes an external opportunity. Reports circulate of internet disruptions, some say nationwide blackouts, others say partial. Iran is large, roughly 90 million people, and information warfare thrives in that fog. But what is undeniable is the role of outside actors, amplifying the narrative, especially the celebration of Starlink access as a means of controlling what information escapes to the world. Then we get a striking detail, the claim that Elon Musk's platform removed an Iranian flag marker and replaced it with monarchist symbolism, treating an internal national crisis like a branding exercise. Whether every detail of these reports is perfectly framed or not, the larger point stands. Major Western platforms are not neutral conduits. They are instruments sometimes blunt, sometimes subtle, within a broader regime change toolkit. And then there's the exiled prince, Reza Pahlavi, calling on Trump to strike, urging intervention, effectively lobbying for foreign military action to topple the Iranian government. This, too, is a familiar script. Exiles and NGOs act as moral cover. Western media amplifies. Western intelligence networks cultivate civil society pressure, and then political leaders keep repeating trigger phrases if the protesters are shot. All hell will break loose until the public is conditioned to accept escalation. When Trump repeats that line over and over, if protesters are harmed, all hell will break loose, it doesn't read like spontaneous concern, it reads like prepositioning. It reads like the rhetorical predicate for a future action, perhaps even for a manufactured incident, some event that will be blamed on Tehran and used to justify strikes. I don't claim certainty about what will happen, but I recognize the pattern well enough to say the language is being prepared in advance. While that tension simmers, Britain's still playing its role as the eager auxiliary announces accelerated funding, £200 million directed toward preparations for deploying forces as part of a multinational arrangement tied to a ceasefire scenario in Ukraine, plus air defense support. The political messaging is comically self-referential. A secure Ukraine means a secure UK. No, it doesn't. Not in the literal sense being implied, but it does mean the UK stays welded to Washington's strategic line, keeps contracts flowing, keeps defense procurement humming, and keeps the Ukraine narrative alive as a justification for domestic political choices. And yes, another infusion into the washing machine, round and round it goes. And here we are. On the one hand, talk of America first. On the other hand, an $800 billion decade-long commitment to Ukraine, a deepening oil client relationship with Venezuela, threats over Greenland, and a drumbeat building around Iran. If this is America first, it is a very strange version of it, one where American energy goes outward, American money goes outward, and American risk goes outward, while infrastructure, education, and real domestic renewal are treated as afterthoughts. Imagine for a moment what $800 billion over 10 years could do inside the United States: bridges, rail, water systems, power grids, manufacturing, resilience. But that's not where this machine points. It points outward toward geopolitical leverage and resource capture. And because the modern information ecosystem demands a circus at the end of every grim narrative, the broadcast closes with Clown World, a viral social media moment involving Justin Trudeau and Katy Perry, accompanied by a snarky timeline of Trudeau's career, from snowboard instructor to substitute teacher to media personality to the man who, in the eyes of his critics, crippled a G7 economy and then became a celebrity boyfriend. The humor is cheap, but it works as a pressure valve. The audience laughs, the mind resets, the outrage gets packaged into memes, and the deeper structural issues fade behind the spectacle. That's not an accident. That's the political media cycle we live in. Massive geopolitical decisions, followed by celebrity distraction, followed by another round of massive decisions. So when you step back and connect the dots, Ukraine reconstruction money, lithium tenders, oil oligarch meetings, Greenland coercion, Venezuela, investability, Iran narrative conditioning, and Britain's reflexive cash burn, what you see is not a coherent peace strategy. What you see is an empire in motion, redistributing capital and risk in ways that benefit a narrow class, while using slogans to keep the public disoriented. Russia, for its part, is not confused by any of this. Moscow may not know every backroom detail, but it knows the pattern. Western prosperity packages are rarely about prosperity for the target population, they are about ownership. Western security guarantees are rarely about security for the region, they are about leverage. And Western moral narratives, whether about democracy in Ukraine, liberation in Venezuela, or human rights in Iran, are often the velvet glove over a very familiar fist. That is the story beneath the headlines. The machinery of control, lubricated by money, wrapped in rhetoric, and pushed forward by people who never pay the costs of the policies they sell. And this is where the fog clears, where the noise of Davos headlines, billionaire lithium tenders, oil boardroom optimism, and rehearsed moral talking points collapses into a single hard shape. It isn't peace being negotiated. It isn't reconstruction being planned. It isn't security being guaranteed. What is being built quietly, deliberately, and with almost insulting confidence is an architecture of extraction of resources, extraction of sovereignty, extraction of narrative control, and extraction of public attention. The public is handed a story about prosperity packages and post-war renewal, but the sums are so large and the timing so convenient that the real function becomes obvious. A decade-long commitment doesn't restrain corruption, it normalizes it. It doesn't prevent capture, it institutionalizes it. It doesn't reduce risk, it spreads it across time until the public stops paying attention and the contracts become just how things are. 10 years is enough for a temporary emergency to become a permanent system. And the system always needs new frontiers. Ukraine becomes the prosperity project while its subsoil is quietly priced, tendered, and promised. Venezuela becomes the energy stabilization project while the word investable is used like a moral verdict, meaning submit your laws to our comfort or you deserve poverty. Greenland becomes the strategic necessity while coercion is marketed as inevitability, easy way or hard way, as if sovereignty were a nuisance to be negotiated away. Iran becomes the human rights emergency where trigger phrases are repeated until the media has its justification preloaded, ready to fire the moment a suitable incident arrives. Different slogans, same machine. And notice what's missing from all of it: humility, restraint, any honest accounting of cost, any admission that Western intervention has, again and again, produced blowback, radicalization, economic ruin, and waves of migration that are then used to frighten domestic populations into accepting even harsher policy. The people selling this system never say, "We were wrong." They just change the label and reboot the campaign. This is why the capture Putin question matters far more than it should. It's not merely absurd on its face, it is a diagnostic test. It tells you how normalized the language of imperial prerogative has become, how casually a head of state can be spoken of as a target to be seized, as if international law were a guideline for weaker countries and an inconvenience for stronger ones. Once that language is normalized, everything else becomes easier. Sanctions become permanent, seizures become routine, extraterritorial arrests become tools, and war becomes something you can toggle on and off depending on which boardroom needs which leverage. Russia understands this reality because Russia has lived on the receiving end of it for decades. Russia does not need to guess what Washington means by security guarantees or economic partnership. Russia has watched the pattern unfold across Eastern Europe, across the Middle East, across Latin America. Russia knows that guarantees often mean encirclement, that prosperity often means privatization under duress, and that democracy promotion too often means selecting leaders who will sign away the nation's future with a smile. And that is why the West's public messaging keeps failing to move Moscow. You cannot shame a state into surrender by reciting slogans it has already studied, already mapped, already endured. You cannot intimidate a power that measures you not by your press conferences, but by your industrial base, your social cohesion, your appetite for sustained sacrifice, and your ability to keep promises longer than a news cycle. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The West is not demonstrating strength by multiplying commitments. It is demonstrating addiction to narrative, to control, to the belief that money and media can substitute for strategy. When leaders talk about $800 billion here, $100 billion there, and hard way deals elsewhere, it is not a display of confidence. It is a display of a system that cannot stop feeding itself. Every crisis becomes an opportunity. Every opportunity becomes a contract. Every contract becomes a constituency. And every constituency becomes a pressure group demanding the next crisis. That is not stability. That is not leadership. That is a loop. And loops eventually snap. They snap when reality refuses to cooperate. When battlefield facts don't align with conference room fantasies. When supply chains break. When public patience runs out. When currencies wobble under the weight of perpetual external ambition. When allies quietly hedge because they can't trust the center to remain coherent. When easy way or hard way bravado collides with the stubborn truth that other nations are not props. The final irony is this. The very people who speak most loudly about defending democracy keep advancing policies that hollow out their own. They demand sacrifice from citizens while insulating elites from consequence. They preach national interest while outsourcing it to transnational agendas. They talk about borders while financing wars that erase borders and displace millions. They promise prosperity abroad while telling their own populations to accept crumbling infrastructure and manage decline. So if you want to understand what comes next, stop staring at the slogans. Watch the incentives. Watch who gets paid. Watch who gets protected. Watch who gets silenced. Watch how quickly the moral vocabulary changes the moment it stops being useful. Watch which facts are treated as sacred and which facts are treated as heresy. And then ask the only question that matters. Who benefits from this arrangement continuing? Because if the answer is always the same, if it is always the same class, the same corporations, the same networks, the same careerists, then the conclusion is unavoidable. This isn't a series of accidents, it is a design. And designs can be resisted, they can be exposed. They can be broken, especially when the public finally sees that the prosperity package is not a gift, the investment framework is not neutral, and the security guarantee is often just a euphemism for a permanent leash. Russia is not the one being managed here. Russia is the obstacle to management. That is why the pressure will intensify. That is why the rhetoric will sharpen. That is why the provocations will keep coming. Greenland, Venezuela, Iran, Ukraine, because the machine needs motion to hide its own emptiness. But the more it accelerates, the more it reveals itself. And once it is revealed, it becomes much harder to sell. That is where we are now. At the edge of a moment when the empire's language is slipping, its contradictions are stacking, and its deals are starting to sound less like diplomacy and more like extortion. The world is watching. Moscow is watching. And so are the people who have been told again and again that they must pay for projects that never seem to end. In the end, the choice is not between easy way and hard way. That is the empire's framing. The real choice is whether nations remain sovereign or whether they accept a future where sovereignty is conditional on being investable, compliant, and useful to someone else's grand strategy. And that, stripped of all the theater, is the real battlefield.